everyone, and welcome to Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. It's always a pleasure to have you on, those of you who are live, and of course it's lovely to welcome those of you who are watching this on YouTube. Just a reminder, if you are watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe to my channel and be updated whenever it is that we upload a new video. I think we upload at least a couple of videos a week, sometimes 2 or 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, but we'd love to have you as part of our YouTube community. So if you see there's a little icon there at the bottom of the screen, just if you can press on it and subscribe, if you can click on the button which has a little picture of me and subscribe to my YouTube channel, we'd love to have you on board. The other thing is that we do usually have sponsors for our Treasures from the Rabbi's Library or any of my videos, and I would welcome the opportunity of you being a sponsor. And if you're interested, please can you email me rabbi@rabbidunner.com, RABBIDUNNER.com. I have actually some requests today because I was going to share a very interesting piece that I have today, but I don't yet have all the information necessary for that piece, and I want to ask you, if you're watching this, to help me with information, what I call my Baker Street irregulars. You know that in all of Sherlock Holmes' stories, he had in each individual story a few people who were helping him. He called them his Baker Street irregulars because they weren't people who helped him for every case, but on the occasional case they would become involved. So if you could become one of my Baker Street irregulars, I would appreciate that very much. And today I'm going to ask you, in a minute I'm going to ask you, in another situation I'm going to ask you about another piece of information that I require help on. It's not me, I'm going to be asking for someone else, but in this instance let me begin by saying that there was a rabbi, very prominent Hasidic rabbi in Monsey called Rabbi Avraham Weinfeld. He died at quite a young age. He was in his 50s in 1987. He was a prolific writer. He wrote Shailas HaTshuvos and he wrote Hashkofa, and he was quite an influential rabbi in Monsey. And there's a piece that I'd like to discuss and describe on one of my episodes of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. But I would like, if possible, a photograph of Rabbi Weinfeld. So if you have that, please share it with me. And any information that you may have about him and his life and his activities in Monsey, New York, over the years when he was active, sometime between the late 1950s and the 1980s when he passed away. Another person I'm interested in the same connection, it's to do with the same piece that I'm going to be talking about, is Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Sosna. He was an interesting man. He was a Talmud of Lakewood who lived later on in his life in Borough Park. He died in 2014, and I know that he has family in Lakewood. I'd love to obtain, if possible, a photograph of him and to know a little bit more about his life and his activities. I know that he used to go and speak in all the different yeshivas about the importance of studying Torah, and he was very much for the focus on Torah study and in doing everything that you can to maintain and sustain the study of Torah in the Jewish world. So if you have any information or photographs of Rabbi Mordechai Tzvi Sosna, please, if you could get in touch with me, rabbi@rabbidunner.com. I'm going to begin today, if I may, by talking about the Yabloner Rebbe. The Yablon Araba, who most of you, if not all of you, know, was someone I discussed a couple of years ago in a video that was seen by many people. The Yabloner Rebbe was a prominent Hasidic Rebbe in Poland who took his Chassidim and started off a town, a farming community in Eretz Yisrael, in the north of Eretz Yisrael, near Haifa, and he did it together with the Kosnitzer Rebbe. But in any event, he disappeared after this settlement, this town, this farming community was not successful. He disappeared to America and unfortunately abandoned his religion And he lived in Los Angeles, where I am now. He lived for 40 years, if you can believe it, and people didn't know who he was until eventually, as a result of an intervention from a member of his family, he came back to Nachlas Yaakov, which he'd established. It was now called Kfar Hasidim, and he came back there in the early 1980s, and he went back to his religious faith and became the Yablon Araba again, and he died in 1986. He was 90 years old. An extraordinary man. It's an extraordinary story, and those of you who haven't seen it, you can do a search with my name and Yablon Araba, and you'll come across all the information. I wrote an extensive article about it in Tablet, and I did a lot of research. But of course, you can never finish doing research, because as much research as you do, there's always more information. I want to share some of the things with you that I've come up with since that video came out in 2018, and it's extremely important information. We're going to look at some photographs. First of all, this is the original pamphlet, which I bought many years ago, which interested me in the Yablon Araba, Chasidim Olu El Haaretz. I think I featured this when I did my video about the Yablon Araba. It contains photographs, incredible photographs of the farming community. It was written by and published by the JNF, which is a Zionist organization. Here you have Chassidim, Yabloner Chassidim, with horses in the field. They're doing ploughing, and you see those clearing the swamps here in quite incredible photographs here of Chassidim from Poland who've done all this incredible stuff. And here you have the class of Chassidish children who are studying, as it were, in a little cheder at Kfar Chassidim in the 1920s. You see the ladies, Chassidish ladies, doing the milking of the cows. It was an incredible story. Here's a photograph of the Beis Medrash in Kfar Chassidim in those days. You can see the Chassidim there, they're davening and they're learning, etc. So this was the original pamphlet that interested me in the story of the Yablon Araba, and that's where I got the information. Since that time, lots of people have sent me information, and of course there's been a resurgence of interest. I understand from Kfar Chassidim, and I've been to visit Kfar Chassidim since I broadcast that the initial video, the original time that I spoke about him. And I've been to Kfar Chassidim. They tell me that now on a regular basis people are streaming to Kfar Chassidim, to the Beis Olam, to the cemetery there, and they're visiting and saying Tehillim at the graveside of the Yabloner Rebbe, Rabbi Yechezkel Taub, or as he was known here in Los Angeles, George Nagel. Here is an interesting piece which I came across, which is in my collection. It's a periodical called Hahed. I'm not quite sure who published it, but it looks to me like it was published by some type of religious group that was interested in Zionism, or at least in settling Eretz Yisrael. And it's the headline on the front page is Ha'emes al Moshe Chassidim be'Eretz Yisrael. It has here a detailed interview with the Yabloner Rebbe about a number of people there, and how much money they'd raise and what they've done, etc., how much territory there is, how much, what the shetach is, etc. Quite a remarkable interview, very unique. There's so much about the Yablon Araba which has still not been researched, and truthfully it's upsetting, because I think that he's worthy of certainly it could be a documentary, it could be a PhD, it could be somebody who's researched him. I've done the initial research, and anyone is welcome to come to me, and I will share with them all the information that I already have, and we will do our best together to get as much information as is needed to turn this story into something which is more widely known, because as widely known as it is, it's still one of the most remarkable stories of the early period after the Balfour Declaration and before the declaration of the State of Israel. I have here some more photographs. I received some original photographs, So you saw that the front cover of Hasidim Olu El Oretz has this picture of the Rebbe speaking to the Chaklaim, to the farmers. So I have here, this is original photograph that I have. This is a picture of the Yablon Araba when he arrived in Kfar Hasidim. This is how he looked. So you can see, and you're going to see as he slowly changed over the years. So this is a few years later. You can see his hair is a little bit different in this photograph. And here's a picture, a profile picture. Again, you can see that he's looking a little bit less like a Rebbe after a few years at Kfar Hasidim. Then he went to New York and he stayed with his niece. And he was fundraising. It's a picture of him in New York when he first arrived in the late 1930s in New York. He was raising money for Kfar Hasidim, which was losing money. And then, of course, we know he shaved off his beard and he became George Nagel. Here's a picture of him with one of his relatives, a child sitting on his lap. I have many more such photographs of the Yablon Rebbe during this period as George Nagel. And here's a very rare photograph which was sent to me by a member of his family. Quite an incredible photograph, because I'll explain to you why it's incredible, because many people have asked me, what happened to the Yabloner Rebbe's wife? She was herself a Yachsen. She came from a Chassidish family, and she came with him to Kfar Hasidim. It seems they never had children. It's not clear that the relationship between them was so positive, but there's no evidence as to what happened to her. And what was so curious is that in his papers here, when he applied for citizenship in the United States, he writes that his wife lives in Tel Aviv. But it would appear that she no longer lived in Tel Aviv and that she went back to Europe to be with her family, because he had gone to America and she was spending long periods of time without him, and she obviously did not enjoy living in Kfar Hasidim. And I have no evidence for this, and of course I welcome any intrepid researcher who is watching this to find out more information than I have been able to, but it would appear to me that she perished in the Holocaust. I don't have any evidence and would welcome any information in that regard. But here is the only picture I've ever found of her. It's a picture of the Yabloner Rebbe together with his wife, and here they are in Kfar Hasidim during that very early period in the mid-1920s when he first arrived. So that, you would think, is all I have to say about the Yablon Rebbe, but no, in fact, I'm very, very lucky, because when I went to visit Kfar Hasidim about a year ago, I was extremely lucky that I received from a member of his family his talus. And I have it here. I've actually created a very special talus bag for it. I'm not generally into chafetzim. I don't collect things which are not books or manuscripts, but as you know, collecting is a bug. So if you are collecting, there's no such thing as when you're offered something which is a collectible saying, I'm not interested. If something is collectible and it's somehow connected to something that you're interested in, you'll collect it. So this is the case with the Yablon Rebbe's talus, which I have here. I'm going to take it out. I'm not going to open it completely or put it on because it's extremely delicate. It's the talus that he brought with him from Poland. He brought it with him to America, and it probably lay unused for many, many years. You can see here the original Atorah. It's not a silver Atorah that one would expect from a talus of a Rebbe, but it has some repairs to it. And what's so interesting is that the tzitzis on it, which are on the talus, are obviously not the original tzitzis. They are tzitzis which he made or remade when he came back to Kfar Hasidim in 1981. So obviously this was a talus that he started wearing again much later on in life. I don't have his tefillin, but I do have his talus, and it's a great privilege to be the guardian of this relic of the Yabloner Rebbe, who lived in Los Angeles for so many years and whose story I was lucky enough to share with everyone when it first came out. So now, I want to turn to another story completely. This is a fascinating piece that I'm going to share with you now. It's something that touches a lot of the different nerves with regard to Hungarian Jewry in the interwar period, but I'm going to address it via its main protagonist, who was a man called Reb Shaul Brach. Now, Reb Shaul Brach was the Rav of Kashau. That's how he's known. He was the Rav of Kashau during the interwar years. It would appear that he became the Rav in Kashau at some point in, I'm not sure exactly, but after the First World War, and he remained the Rav of Kashau. In fact, his influence, Kashau, by the way, is Kosice in Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, and it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Obviously, that empire was disintegrated after the First World War and was the center of a lot of conflict during the Second World War. But Kashau was a very strong, very determined Jewish community, and he was the Rav of Kashau. Now, the thing is, and here's the piece. We're going to look at some of the pieces here. I have here actually a photograph of Shaul Brach. I know that there are Brachs who live today in New York. They're not descended from him. He only had daughters. So there's no one who's called Brach today who's descended from Reb Shaul Brach. Now, what's interesting is that there was another very great, very strong-willed and very influential rabbi who lived in Kashau during the interwar years, and his name was Reb Shmuel Engel, Maharash Engel. Maharash Engel was a great Talmud Chacham who came from Radamishel, and he lived in Kashau, and he had his own, I would say, community, but he had the people who gathered around him. He had the shtibel in his house, and he had a lot of people who took him very seriously and went to him for everything. And I guess that meant that they didn't hold Rabbi Brach, Reb Shaul Brach, in the highest esteem. Not that they didn't hold him in any esteem, but for them, Maharash Engel was the most important rabbi. And this is a picture here of Maharash Engel, the Radi Mishnah Rav, and it says here, Ter Pnei Ish Elokim, Kodosh Amaloi, Rabbeinu Haigon, Sarator Rashka Bahag, Chosid Va'onov, Moron Reb Shmuel Engel, Zatu Kal, Ha'abdak Radamishel. Okay, he didn't live in Radamishel for the last years of his life. He lived in Kashau. Now, I have here a very, very interesting, and I would say probably unique poster. It's a handbill, which was, I think, it looks to me, because it's folded in the middle, it looks to me that it was sent out perhaps in the mail. I'm not quite clear as to how it was distributed, but it relates to a horrible machlokas that took place, a disagreement, a controversy, a polemic that took place in Kashau during those years between Rav Shmuel Engel and Reb Shaul Brach. This particular handbill was distributed by supporters of Rav Shaul Brach during this dispute between him and Maharash Engel. Maharash Engel, by the way, died in 1935. Rav Shaul Brach died in 1940. This isn't dated, this particular flyer, and the question was Rav Shaul Brach the legitimate rabbi for Kashau, for Kosice? And the reason why he was being questioned is because Shmuel Engel said, how is it possible for somebody to be the rabbi of a community and then appoint their own son-in-law to become a sheichet, which is exactly what Rav Shaul Brach had done. Now, he was from Radamishel. He wasn't a Rav. He didn't have any official position in Kashau. And nevertheless, he let it be known that he was very dissatisfied with the decision by Rav Shaul Brach to include his son-in-law as one of the official shachtim for the community of Kashau. So why this handbill is so interesting, why this particular flyer is so interesting, is because it purports to contain a letter from Rav Shmuel Engel in which he offers an unequivocal apology for his accusations against Rav Shaul Brach. He says here that he regrets greatly that he ever became involved in this machlokas, and he can't imagine why he would have accused of Shaul Brach of these terrible things. He calls him here Rav Agon, HaTzadik, Amiti, Moran, Shlita, Abad, Depo, Kilas Kodesh, Kashau, Tomid, Beinenu, Ahava, Achva, Vereus. There is always between us love, brotherhood, and friendship. So he clearly regretted, according to this handbill, he regretted the fact that he'd ever become engaged in a dispute with Rav Shaul Brach over whatever the issue was. The thing is that I actually showed this flyer to the descendants of Roshmore Engel. You're probably wondering who they are, but I'll tell you. Rav Chuna Halpern in Golders Green, I grew up in Golders Green in London. Rav Chuna Halpern was a grandson of Rav Shmuel Engel. In fact, his shul in Golders Green is called Beis Shmuel, and he would refer to himself as the Radimishler Rov, although I don't think he ever went to Radimishel. He certainly met his grandfather in Kashau, but I don't think he ever went to Radimishel. Here's a picture of Rav Chuna Halpern in his later years, but we grew up with him as a local rabbi in Golders Green. I didn't speak to him, but when I told one of his sons that I had this flyer, he said to me, please don't show it to my father, it's going to give him tremendous agmas nefesh. I said, why would he give him agmas nefesh? If that's what Rav Shmuel Engel said, if he did indeed apologize to Rav Shaul Brach, why would you think that your father would be upset? So he said, no, it's a forgery. This letter was never written, it was forged, it's fraudulent. It was put together by followers of Rav Shaul Brach because they wanted to embarrass, they wanted to put to shame Rav Shmuel Engel, and in fact he was extremely angry when it came out, particularly because it contained derogatory references to the Hasidic community of Kosice. Anyway, I can't tell you whether or not this flyer is actually a genuine letter, contains the transcript of a genuine letter, or if it's fake. I haven't the faintest idea, but I do have it here, and it does contain at least a historical reference to this very interesting dispute that took place in Kosice. Now, Rav Shaul Brach is a very interesting man, extremely influential. I'm going to look at some other things to do with the Rav Shaul Brach. Firstly, I have his Sfarim here, a number of his Sfarim. Most of the Sfarim that I have, even if they're not valuable, are extremely rare. You may be able to get them on HebrewBooks.org, but that would be the extent of it. Here I have, for example, a sefer that's published by a man called Rabbi Yaakov Meir Tzvi Hirsch Ben Dov Friedlander. It's called Derech Yoma, and it's got Havei Somim, Chidushim, Al Shabbos Shuva V'Yoim HaKodosh, and it was put together by Rav Shaul Brach. So it has here rare pieces that are not necessarily published elsewhere. Here they are, that were written and then published later. I think they were published 1936. They were published before he died, so hopefully he saw them and approved them. We also have here a number of books that are well known, and they've probably been republished since they first came out. We have a famous book here, Ovois Albonim, which is a sefer by Rav Shaul Brach on it's on Pirkei Avos. It was published in 1926. It's also a fascinating collection of very interesting ideas on Pirkei Avos, and obviously coloured by his own Weltanschauung, coloured by his own views of the world. And he, for one thing, he has a long introduction in here where he says that anybody who is Yerei Shamayim, anybody who is a God-fearing Jew, should keep their distance from Zionists and from Mizrahi homes and avoid eating and drinking with them as they would with Goyim. And he adds, they ought to be excluded from the community. All Zionists or people who are part of Mizrahi should be excluded from the community. He was a virulent anti-Zionist. And he did appreciate the Hebrew language. He opposed the fact that it was used as a vernacular, as a form of conversation between people. It was, as far as he was concerned, a holy language, Lashon HaKodesh, that can only be used by rabbis in their communication about Torah study, and for rabbis to write books about the Torah. And in his opinion, the Balfour Declaration, he writes this in here in the introduction, was in the interest of the Gentile world, and its purpose being to rid the nations of the world, of the Jews that live in their countries. That's Oves Albonim. Here's another book that was published in Vranov in 1938. It's called Chelek La'olam Haba. It's also Chidushim on Oves, but it also contains many of his very strong opinions about Zionists and secular Jews. Here is a book which I don't believe is in print. It's called Shaul Bechir Hashem. It's a biography told us v'zichronos imechayev shel Rabbeinu Hagon HaKodesh Ateres Tiferes Yisrael Moran Rabbi Shaul Brach. No photographs. Clearly, he didn't want to be photographed, and those who honor his memory refused to publish photographs of him in the book that is in his memory. And it also contains a very interesting section in this book about the community, the Jewish community of Kasha. That is the book about Rav Shaul Brach, his biography. One last thing about him before I have a piece which I want to show you, which is really quite remarkable. I once discovered this. I don't know if it's ever been published properly. This looks to me like a stenciled piece that was published in 1967 by a fellow called Reb Meir Tzvi Rottenberg. I don't know who it is, and it was published in Givat Shaul, and it was published. It contains chidushim and all types of interesting pieces of information from Reb Shaul Brach, stenciled. These are two. I don't know if they're the same, but these are two publications which contain, it says here, Talmidoi Neched Achoisoi. It says that Reb Meir Tzvi Rottenberg was a Talmud of Reb Shaul Brach and is the grandson of his sister. And he's published Chidushim. I don't know if these have ever been republished, and maybe I should republish them because they are very interesting. We're going to now look at one more piece about Reb Shaul Brach, relating to Reb Shaul Brach, and it's this piece here. I once obtained it, believe it or not, on eBay. You sometimes can get an unexpected bargain on eBay, and I have a whole collection of machlokas material relating to Rabbi Yoelish Teitelbaum when he left Krula, Noji Karol, which was a town in Hungary, Romania, depending which week it was, where the border was. He was the Rav there, and in 1928, Rabbi Yoelish Teitelbaum was appointed to become the Rav of Satmar, and he didn't take up the position until 1934. Now, the thing is that when he became the Rav of Krula, he took over the position from Reb Shaul Brach. Reb Shaul Brach had been the Rav of Krula before he went to Kasha, and he didn't get the position. He didn't take up the position in Satmar immediately because it was a very contentious appointment. I have probably half a dozen or more pieces relating to that extremely contentious dispute between the elements in the Satmar community who did not want Rabbi Yoelish to be the rabbi, and the elements in the Satmar community who did, and it involved the authorities, and there were vicious attacks by both sides on their opponents. But at the same time as that was going on, there was all types of goings on in Krula. Why? Because people felt that Rabbi Yoelish was too extreme, and as soon as he left, they appointed to replace him a man called Rabbi Abishal Horovitz. Rabbi Abishal Horovitz was the son-in-law of the Spinker Rebbe, who lived in Munkach, who had his own problems with the Munkacher Rebbe, perhaps a story for another time. But Rabbi Abishal Horovitz became the official appointed Rav of Krula. Rabbi Yoelish refused to accept that he would be his replacement because he felt that some of the people who had elected him were not appropriate to elect a rabbi because they didn't keep all the traditions and restrictions that had been agreed in the community previous to him coming there. And therefore he arranged for Reb Shmuel Gross, who was a relative of his, to become the rabbi of the Yereim community in Krula, and there was a bitter dispute between the followers of Rabbi Yoelish, who had Reb Shmuel Gross as their rabbi, and the followers of Reb Abishal, the Spinker Hasidim, let's call them, who were the main community of Krula, and this dispute obviously continued until the fateful day when the entire community was loaded onto cattle trucks and taken to Auschwitz, and on the same day both Reb Shmuel Gross and Reb Abishal Horowitz were killed in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Reb Abishal had a son called Reb Tzvi. Reb Herschel Spinker, he lived in Williamsburg. He seems to have reconciled himself with Rabbi Yoelish and became very close to him when Rabbi Yoelish lived in Williamsburg and was known as the Satmar Rebbe in Williamsburg, and established the very powerful and strong and influential community there of Chassidim. But the piece I have here, which I'm about to show you, I believe that the person who listed it and who I bought it from some 10 or 15 years ago was not Jewish. He must have found it, and look, it's scribbled, somebody scribbled all over it, and he must have found it perhaps between the pages of a book. It was a flybill, it was a flyer that was handed out in Krula. Who signed the flyer? None other than Reb Shaul Brach, who was at that time the Rav of Kashau. And he went to visit. It seems that he came on a visit to Kashau, from Kashau to Krula. And he says, Kosice esoir. As soon as I left the city or the town of Krula, Matzasi es atzmi mechuyev lohidia. I found myself obligated to inform Bnei Ha'ir Krula, the people who live in Krula, in other words, those who are part of the Jewish community of Krula, Shaloi la'achar afilu kasha ad boi levesi she'oz agale le'enei koil es ha'nevolos shenase be'irchem va'ad oz teidu. He says, I need to let you know of the horrible and horrific things that are taking place in your city. What a disgrace it is that this is going on. And he says, you need to know the following. Anybody who eats from the shechita, from the ritual slaughter, meat, that so-called kosher meat that's put out by the menuvel, menuvel is a terrible word. Menuvel means a miscreant, a degenerate, from remit, tzorich lahachshir kelov, you have to take all of your vessels and your plates and your pots and your pans and your knives and your forks to be koshered, because you're not allowed to use that meat, it's treif. Who is the menuvel miremet? Let me tell you. The Rabbi Abishal Horowitz came from Remit, that's where he came from. The menuvel miremit is none other than Rabbi Abishal Horowitz, the son-in-law of the Spinker Rebbe, who was the Rav of Krula, and who Reb Shaul Brach utterly despised because he supported the team of Rabbi Yoelish in terms of who should be leading the community and who should be running the Jewish affairs of the community in Krula. Of course, he'd been the rabbi there before Rabbi Yoelish, and it was his regulations and the things that he'd put in place that he felt and Rabbi Yoelish were being undermined by the new rabbinic leadership under Rabbi Abishal. So a very interesting piece here. Very rare. I would imagine that this is the only one in the world. Okay, so let's move on from there. We're going to talk about an extremely interesting piece which I've had for many, many years. I've had occasion over the last few weeks to talk about, and I want to share it with you. The piece is from a place called Erdenberg. You've probably never heard of Erdenberg, because the way that we refer to it in the Jewish world is not Erdenberg, and I don't think it's referred to that way at all anymore. It's called Shopron. Shopron is in Hungary, and Shopron was a place, there wasn't a big Jewish community there. There were 2,000 Jews, roughly, who lived in Shopron in the early part of the 20th century. And the Rav of Shopron was a man called Rabbi Menachem Greenwald. He was born in 1842, and he died in 1929, and he was the Rav of Shopron. His parents were called Pinchas and Yecheved. He was a student of Rabbi Eliezer Sussman Sofer, who was not from the Chassam Sofer family, he was from the Munkach Sofer family, and also actually of Rabbi Shmuel Binyamin Sofer Pressburg, Bratislava, who was the Ksav Sofer. He went to his yeshiva in Pressburg. He married Malka, who was the daughter of Reb David Naiman Lachenbach, who was a Rav in Pressburg. He was a distinguished rabbi himself. He, by the way, got married a second time to Sarah, who was a cousin of his wife. After his first wife died, he remarried, and she was the daughter of Rabbi Yitzchak Kramer, who was the Rav of Beni Heisel. He was a very close friend. He knew him from yeshiva of Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld also learned by the Ksav Sofer, and they remained in close touch over the years. Obviously, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld is much better known because he was the Rav of the Yishuv HaYoshon in Yerushalayim, of the Haredi community in Yerushalayim during those critical years after the Balfour Declaration and before the establishment of the State of Israel. He's an extremely well-known Hungarian rabbi who lived in Yerushalayim, as was very powerfully influential during that period. But he had many friends back in Hungary, and one of them was Rabbi Menachem Greenwald of Shopron. Now, Rabbi Menachem Greenwald died at the age of 87 years old. He'd been the rabbi, I think, for almost 50 years in Shopron. So who should replace him? So in Hungary, they were very traditional. And generally speaking, unless there was a very good reason not to have the son of the incumbent rabbi to replace the father, they would always ask, in the first instance, for a son. If a son went to yeshiva, had smicha, had some training as a rabbi, perhaps been the rabbi of another community somewhere else before his father had passed away, they would ask that son, or one of the sons who fit that bill, to become the rabbi when their father died. It would seem that in Shopron that didn't happen. And the person that they chose was a man called Rabbi Shimon Posen. We're going to talk more about him in a minute. Here is a poster. Again, it's got to be extremely rare. This poster is a cry, a protest. It's called Kol Koreh. A protest by all of those who supported the children of Rabbi Menachem Greenwald because they had not been consulted, they'd not been included in the nomination, the appointment of a new rabbi. Rabbi Posen had been chosen, and they felt that Rabbi Posen was a totally inappropriate choice to become the Rav of Shopron. They weren't successful in their attempts to unseat him from his place, and Rabbi Shimon Posen, who survived the Holocaust, later on moved to Williamsburg, became the Rosh Yeshiva in the Sapni Yeshiva in Williamsburg, and he's got many descendants. The Posen family are very well known. In Williamsburg, they've intermarried with the Meisels family, and it's a very choshev family. But who were the Posens? So we're going to talk about that before we come back to Rabbi Menachem Greenwald. The Posen family, by the way, here's a picture of Rabbi Menachem Greenwald. This is what he looked like. He was a fascinating individual, and we don't have a sefer from him, but there are chidushim that he wrote which are included in another sefer. So Shimon Posen was a chassid of Munkach. Here's an unknown picture of the Munkacher Rebbe, which I'm going to share with you. Here you go. This is the Munkacher Rebbe, the Minchas Elazar, Chaim Elazar Shapira. He was a Munkacher chassid, but he's a bit of an unlikely Munkacher chassid because most Munkacher chassidim came from Hungary or Czechoslovakia. They certainly didn't come from where he came from. Where did he come from? So his last name is a bit of a giveaway. His family originally came from a place called Posen, which was in Bohemia, but eventually they moved to Frankfurt. And his father, Rabbi Shimon Posen's father, was a dayan in Frankfurt. Here's a picture of him, Rabbi Gershon Posen. He was a dayan on the Frankfurt Kehillah. As you can see, he's wearing a stiff collar and a bow tie, not something that would generally see Munkacher Chassidim wearing. And he was a very, very distinguished dayan and rabbi, highly respected. He had a number of children. And one of them was this Shimon Posen. Now Shimon Posen, Rabbi Shimon Posen, the Shopron Rav, actually went to Gießen University, and he wrote a dissertation And much later on, when he became very Chassidish, we'll hear in a minute why he became Chassidish, he tried to destroy all the copies of his dissertation, which contained quotations from people that one would not expect a Chassid of the Untitled Rebbe to quote. But here it is. This is a copy that made its way somehow to Los Angeles. It's part of the University of California Library of PhD dissertations, and it's been posted online. You can find it online. You can find the link online to get to his dissertation. You'd have to be fluent in German to read it. Über wissenschaftliche Wahrheit. Dissertation, Erlangung der Doktorwürde, and it's a part of the Faculty of Philosophy at Gießen University. And you can see here, if you can see closely, I'm sure that Carly will put this up on the YouTube, it says Shimon Posen. Well, there you go. Rabbi Shimon Posen, who was the Rav of Shopron, actually had a PhD from a university in Germany and came from Frankfurt. How did he become Chassidish? Well, during the First World War, he was born in the 1890s, and during the First World War, he was part of the German army. And he, as part of his duties as a German soldier, he went all the way to Kiev. And when he was in Kiev, he met the Belzer Rebbe. And he became a Chassid. He was so taken by Chassidus, he decided, if I survive as a soldier during the First World War, when this war is over, I am going to go to yeshiva. I'm becoming a Chassid. That's exactly what happened. He went to Engel in Hungary. He joined the yeshiva there and became a devoted Chassid of the Untitled Rebbe. Here is a picture of him in later life. This is a picture of Rabbi Shimon Posen. This is a picture of his grave, and on his grave it says that Harab Shimon Yisrael Posen ben Arav Gomer in Arav Gershon Shohiadain Bekak Frankfurt the Main Shimesh Barabonis Bekal Yereim Shopron. He served as a rabbi in the Yereim community of Shopron. And he also served in other communities in Hungary. By the way, that was after he'd survived the Holocaust. And he learned for many years with the Talmidim of his yeshiva. That's the Satmar Yeshiva in Williamsburg. Most of them, interesting, it doesn't say all of them, most of them ended up as fearers of God and followers of the derech, of the way of the Baal Shem Tov, Zechusa Yogan Aleinu. Ubizchus zeh Yerachim av harachmim olav, and in this merit may God have mercy on him. Nifta b'shvish of Pesach, he died on the 7th day of Pesach, and the year is Tovshin Chavtes 1969. In fact, it's a famous story. He was buried on the 2nd day of Yom Tov, and they took him, and he was buried in the New Square Cemetery, which is in upstate New York. Very rare that this happens, but people, when it does happen that somebody dies on the first day of Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz, the 2nd day of Yom Tov in New York, there are a number of Hasidic communities that will do a levaya on the 2nd day of Yom Tov, even though it involves Chil Yom Tov and Shabbos. Now, I have a specific interest in the family of Rabbi Shimon Posen, and the reason for that is that I'm actually named after his brother. My name is Pinchas Eliezer Dunner. My first name, Pinchas, is after a great uncle of my mother, who perished in Auschwitz, but my second name, Eliezer, is after Dayan Eliezer Posen, here pictured together with his brother, the Shopron of, but you can see here how Dayan Posen of London, he was a Dayan on the Kosice Beis Din, and he died also in the same year, 1969. You can see that he looks a little bit more like his father. He's got a stiff collar and a bow tie. But here he is talking to his brother, the Shopron. I don't know if this was in London or in New York, but that's a very famous picture of the two brothers. And in fact, I grew up with this picture on a mantelpiece in my home. Here's a photograph of Dayan Posen Dein Eliezer Posen, the Shopron Rov's brother, speaking at my parents' wedding. You can see my mother there in the background and my grandfather from Holland. And there he is addressing the guests at my parents' wedding in Rotterdam in August 1960. Now, we're going to come back to Rabbi Greenwald. We mentioned Rabbi Greenwald. We're going to talk a little bit more about him. And I want to really refer to the fact that one of his children should have inherited the position in Shopron. One way or another, obviously we saw the Kol Korah, where we understand from the contents of the Kol Korah, which by the way throughout refers to Rabbi Shimon Posen as Dr. Simon Posen and accuses him of being an extremist who attracts the attention only of idiots and amaratzim and people who know nothing, who just like extremism. They were clearly not enamored with his leadership in Shopron, at least the followers of the Grunwald family. They weren't successful, but the reason why it's so interesting is that the truth is Rav Grunwald had a number of children who were very much suited to the position of taking up the rabbinate in Shopron. One has to wonder why they were not chosen, why it is that the children of Rav Grunwald were not chosen. He had 14 children. One of his children was Rabbi Yehuda Grunwald, and he later became the Rav of Lucerne. He died in 1947. Lucerne is in Switzerland. Well, he was a Rav. Why couldn't he become the Rav of Shopron in 1930? Another son was Rabbi Shmuel Greenwald. He was a sheichet in Shopron. He remained a sheichet in Shopron even under the leadership, the rabbinic leadership of Rabbi Shimon Posen. Why wasn't he chosen to become the rabbi in Shopron? Not known. By the way, he was killed in the Holocaust in 1944. There was another son, Rabbi Shia. And Rabbi Shia, he was a rabbi in Italy for a brief time, and then later on he moved to New York, where he was the Rav of a shul in New York. He died in 1970. Why couldn't he have been the Rav of Shopron? I think that the answer may be that not all of Rabbi Greenwald's children fit the bill as to what one would expect the rabbi of such a community to be, and that being the case, there may have been those in the community that were a little concerned about choosing as his replacement somebody who came from the Greenwald family. Who am I referring to? You may have heard the name Marcio Grundvald. Marcio Grundvald was a son of the Rav of Shopron, Rabbi Menachem. And he was a very devoted follower of the Mizrahi movement. You know that in Hungary, as you just heard from Rav Shaul Brach, people did not consider the Mizrahi movement to be within the fold, as it were, of religious Judaism. And if somebody, even if they were fully religious, was a member of Mizrahi, they had counted themselves out. Marcio Grundvald moved to Vienna, and later on in the 1930s he moved to Yerushalayim, and he opened a hotel in the center of Yerushalayim, not far from Kikar Tzion. And he ran this hotel, and he was a follower of Mizrahi. I have here a picture of him. It's a picture of Marcio Grundvald. But that's not the reason why I'm mentioning him. The reason I'm mentioning him is because Marcio Grundvald fancied himself as a journalist. And in the early 1950s, he decided that he was a bit bored with running his hotel, and he decided he's going to publish a news sheet. And he needed news. By the way, he was not a fluent Hebrew writer, and he would write in Hungarian and have it translated into Hebrew, and it was 3 or 4 stenciled pages, and he'd print 1,000 copies. He must have had a bit of money from the hotel, so it could pay for the printing, and he would hand deliver these news sheets to all the shop owners and homes around central Jerusalem. And in a number of these news sheets, he accused a senior Hungarian-born Zionist leader called Israel Kastner, Rudolf Kastner, of having collaborated with the Nazis in order to save a bunch of elite Jews from Hungary, and as a result of that, allowed Hungarian Jewry to be massacred. More than 500,000 Hungarian Jews, there were 800,000 Jews in Hungary before the Second World War, more than 500,000 Hungarian Jews were massacred in Auschwitz in a very brief period of time between the early, I think it was in the spring of 1944 and the late summer of 1944. If you can imagine how difficult that is. I mean, logistically speaking, the Nazis went to work on Hungarian Jewry and they utterly decimated them, and it was absolutely frightening. And during that period of time, there was a very small number of Jews who made it out on what is known as the Castner Train as a result of the accusations contained in Marcio Grundvald's news sheets. He was sued by the Israeli government, no less. He was defended by Shmuel Tamir. Any of you have read Perfidy? Perfidy is by Ben Hecht, who was a Hollywood screenwriter. He dramatizes the trial of Rudolf Kastner. It wasn't really the trial of Rudolf Kastner, it was the trial of Marcio Grundvald, son of the Rav of Shopron, who had accused Kastner of being a Nazi collaborator. Here's a picture of Rudolf Kastner in the box during his trial in 1952. And it's quite a crazy story. There have been a number of books. Here's the most recent book about Kastner as to whether or not he was a criminal and a collaborator. It was written by Paul Bogdanor. It's not cheap, but you can buy it on Amazon. It's a fascinating account of the Kastner trial and of Kastner's activities during the Second World War. What's extremely interesting about it is, of course, that many of us, many of you watching this video, know people either personally or descendants personally of those who were saved on the Castner Train. Because so many within Hungarian Jewry did not survive the Holocaust, those who survived and had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are familiar to us, and they came out on the Castner Train. By the way, the Satmar Rebbe himself, Rabbi Yechezkel Taub, came out on the Castner Train, and we're going to be talking more about that in a moment with the last piece that we're going to be describing. But the reason why, and I mentioned at the beginning of our little episode today, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I was contacted by a granddaughter of Marcio Grundvald. She is writing a definitive account, a book about the Greenwald family, and she's struggling with some of the details. Her name is Agnes. She lives in London. Unbelievably, I didn't meet her when I lived in London, but now we are in touch. I've spoken to her on the phone. We've been in email contact. In fact, she sent me an email this morning. She is writing a definitive account of the Greenwald family, and she'd like to know a little bit more about the Greenwald family. So if anybody is watching this and has information or photographs or documents relating to the Greenwald family, she only met her grandfather, Marcio Grundvald, once for 10 minutes when she was 18 years old, when she happened to be on Hachshara in Eretz Israel, and she met him very briefly. She'd never met him before, and it was obviously a little bit awkward. She said he was very nice to her, but it was awkward. She couldn't speak Hungarian, he couldn't speak English, and therefore it was very difficult for them to communicate. But she knows very, very little about her family and would appreciate anybody who can furnish her with more information about the Greenwald family. You can email me at rabbi@rabbidunner.com, and I will share that information with her, and hopefully we can help her write the definitive account of this family from Shopron. We're going to move on to the last piece today, and possibly the most controversial piece that I have in my collection with regard to the Holocaust. It's actually a scary piece because very few people know about it. And I've had it for many years. I've never spoken about it before or shown it to anyone before because it's so incendiary and so difficult to talk about. Excuse me as I just get all these books here from down here. You'll see in a minute what they are, but we'll get to them in a minute. As you know, the Belzer Rebbe, Rabbi Belzer, who died in 1957. Here is a book which I have, which I bound. It was a pamphlet, a leaflet that came out immediately after he died. It was put out by the Aguda, which is very interesting because pre-war the Belz Hasidic group was not Aguda. They were not part of Agudas Yisrael. They had their own community called Machzike Hadas. They were more or less anti-Zionist. And the Belzer Rebbe, who came to Palestine in 1944, and he settled in Tel Aviv. Later on, he opened a place in Yerushalayim. So the Belzer Rebbe became somewhat partial to the Aguda, and in fact he told people to vote for the Aguda slate for Knesset elections, which was something that bothered the Satmar Rebbe very much. Before the war, he would have considered the Belzer Rebbe, Rabbi Aryeh Belzer, to be someone who was on his side, on his team, vis-a-vis opposing Zionism and not cooperating with them in any way, shape or form. But after the Second World War, and with the creation of the State of Israel, the Belzer Rebbe softened his stance, or the stance of the Belz Hasidic group, and they did cooperate, at least in terms of allowing their Hasidim to vote in elections, which Satmar does not. So the Belzer Rebbe ran from pillar to post in Poland. He was known as a Wunderrabbiner, and the Germans, the Nazis, were fully aware of him and tried to find him. And they could never find him. He's always one step ahead of the game and ahead of his pursuers. And he ended up in Bochnia Ghetto, which is in Poland. And during his time in Bochnia Ghetto, which was in the early 1940s, 1942, there were many Chassidim in Budapest, Belzer Chassidim in Budapest, who felt that they should do whatever they can to save the Belzer Rebbe. And ultimately, they managed to bribe officials. There was a man called Landau in Bochnia Ghetto, who was the official liaison between the Jews in the ghetto and the Nazis. And they managed to bribe a bunch of Nazis so that the Belzer Rebbe could escape. And believe it or not, they shaved off his beard. And he was accompanied by his brother, the current Belzer Rebbe's father, Reb Mordechai Bilgeraya, Reb Mordechai Rokach, and a gabbai, a shamus, and they were at the back of the car dressed as Russian officers, and they were made to look as if they were prisoners of war, and they were driven from Bochnia all the way to Budapest. And they came to Budapest in the middle of the war in 1942, where he resided. He went to quite a number of different locations. Over the years, I've been in touch with a number of people who are descended from those who hosted the Belzer Rebbe during his time in Budapest. In early 1944, he left, and once again, he had to shave off his beard, and he eventually arrived via a circuitous route. He arrived in Palestine, and he settled in Tel Aviv. Here is a picture. It's a well-known picture, but many Hasidim will not have seen it. It's a picture of the Belzer Rebbe in Beirut, together with Rabbi Yitzhak Isaac Herzog. You can see that the Belzer Rebbe there is sitting wearing a greatcoat. It's a military coat. His beard is shaved, and he's not wearing a Chassidish hat, and he's sitting together with Rabbi Herzog and various people from the Beirut community behind, and I believe that Yaakov Herzog is also behind in this photograph taken in Beirut in early 1944. Rabbi Herzog went from there further north to Syria, also as part of his efforts to save as many people as possible from the Holocaust, and the Belzer Rebbe went from Beirut by train and arrived in Tel Aviv. So this is a well-known photograph to those who have seen it. It does appear in some books but about Belz, but generally speaking, if it's a book that's published for the Hasidic community, for the Haredi community, they block out or take out the picture of the Belzer Rebbe without a beard because they feel it's disrespectful. That's not what I want to speak about today, because that's not the piece that I'm going to share with you. The piece I'm going to share with you, I'm going to begin by sharing with you this. This is a booklet called Haderech. What is Haderech? Haderech was a periodical that was published by a man called Menachem Lebovich, he was from Chop, which was in Hungary. He lived in Budapest, and it was so-called, it was a periodical. Actually, it wasn't a periodical. It was a vehicle by which they could publish the final address of the Belzer Rebbe before he left before he left Hungary on his way to Palestine, on his way to Eretz Yisrael. Now, you have to understand that for the Jews who were in the midst of Hungary, which was a virulently anti-Semitic country, during the Second World War, they realized, it was very clear to them that Jews were being killed in Poland and in Russia, etc. And they were very scared that the Germans were going to come to Hungary. And as a result of that, they felt that they were protected by virtue of the fact that the Belzer Rebbe lived in their midst. And when they heard that the Belzer Rebbe was about to leave Budapest, they were gravely concerned because they felt that his departure put them in grave danger, put their lives in danger, because he acted as a kind of protection for all the people living in Budapest. So the Belzer Rebbe instructed his brother, Reb Mordechai Bilgeraya, to give a drosha. By the way, Reb Mordechai Bilgeraya was a fantastic speaker. He was a very, very charismatic speaker. He died young. Unfortunately, shortly after the Second World War, he died. He's buried in Tveria. But he was an exceptional speaker, and he was asked by his brother to give over his brother's thoughts in anticipation of their departure for Palestine, for Eretz Yisrael. And one of the things he said, or is purported to have said, but it's denied, is that, don't worry, you've got nothing to worry about. There's nothing for you to concern yourself about. That we are leaving. You're in no danger whatsoever. Now, when this was published eventually, it was published within days of the drosha being given. It seemed very clear and unequivocal that that's what the Bilgeraya Rav had said, that the Belzer Rebbe's brother had said. Very sadly, we know that within a matter of weeks of the departure of the Belzer Rebbe, the Nazis marched into Hungary. They took over from the ruler of Hungary, Admiral Horthy, and they began selections and took Jews and sent them to Auschwitz. Within weeks. This happened within absolute weeks of the Belzer Rebbe's departure. So you can imagine the terrible disappointment with regard to the Belzer Rebbe's drosha, or at least the one that was delivered in his name by his brother. So Haderech is, well, it was actually published 3 times. Thousands of copies were published. Not many survived. I've had a few over the years. But what people don't know is that this is not the only version of the drosha that was published. Everybody knows about the Haderech version. And in fact, the Belz community in Eretz Yisrael have republished it. Here is a pamphlet of a republication of Haderech, although they leave out or rephrase some of the more controversial pieces because they want it to be palatable. They certainly don't want to suggest that the Belzer Rebbe misled anybody with regard to the impending doom of Hungarian Jewry. But what's interesting is this piece, which is a 4th version. There were 3 pamphlets published from Leibovitch and the Haderech version, and then there's this one. It's Mashmiya Yeshua. It's not known. It's really not known. I wonder how many copies there are in the world. Here we are. This is the title page of Mashmiya Yeshua, the drosha that was given by the Bilgeraya Rav in his brother's name just before they left. Mashmiya Yeshua, Hudroshas, Preda, Asher Darash Aravagon HaKodesh, Mereinu Modcha Motler Rakach, Abdak Bilgeraya Shlita, Baskomas Ushlichus Echov, Ochiv Tzadik Hador Ruach HaPeinu, Mereinu Aaron Rakach Shlita Rabbi Mibel, Asher Darash Besudas Preda, Oilio and Base Vo'era Tovshin Daled, Be'ulam Hagodol de Kalyoreim Budapest. Terem Aloisam La'oretz Hakdosha Lachsois B'Noyam Hashem. So this one was published by a man called Reb Nosson Tzvi Friedman. It's not very clear. V'yotze la'or al yedei Atzor Moshe Mishel Halevi Adler Neched Agon HaTzadik Bal Machaba Sefer. Can't read the name of the sefer. It's very. I want to read you a very important piece from this because this is absolutely clear as to what it was the Belzer Rebbe said. It's much clearer than the version in Haderach. I'm going to read it to you. I want to leave you, I'm translating it. Im harabi mebels royalin chayts ka'es letalten es atman akadirose beretzak doisha. The reason why the Rebbe Belz, it's being said that the reason why the Rebbe Belz wants to leave now, it's no question, beli sofek groyahu ki amatzav pa barahu. That the situation here, the reason why the Rebbe is leaving is because the situation here is absolutely terrible. And as a result of this thought that the Belzer Rebbe is leaving because he is concerned about his safety here, is making people very, very anxious. Let me answer you and say as follows. No one knows what my brother is thinking more than me. This is what Rabbi Bilgaraya says. Because day and night I am together with him, I live with him, I spend time with him. I stand together with him and I see everything that he's doing. I want to testify that my brother, the Rabbi Belz Shlita, he believes with absolute clarity that to our brethren here in the country of Hungary, nothing bad will happen. Adarabba v'adarabba. On the contrary, from now on they will be saved from any kind of difficulty and challenges, etc. In other words, unequivocally, the Rebbe of Belz, Tzidim, via his brother, or at least that's what the Belzer Rebbe is saying, that nothing bad would happen to them, and yet within weeks it was a terrible mapola, it was absolute disaster. The Jews of Hungary were slaughtered by the Nazis, more than 500,000 of them. I want to end with this. I have here a remarkable testimony which was sent to me many, many years ago. I don't remember who sent it to me or how I got it. It was sent to me by fax. I put it together here in a spiral bound. It was testimony from a fellow called Moshe Nachum Sternberg. Here's a picture of Moshe Nachum Sternberg. Moshe Nachum Sternberg was a young child who came as part of the youth aliyah during this the period around the time of the Second World War. A number of people managed to obtain visas for their children as a kind of kinder transport to Eretz Yisrael, and he was one of them. He was I think 12 years old. He was born in 1928. I think he came in 1940, if I remember correctly. And he writes here a fascinating story. There was a man called Moshe Shapira. Moshe Shapira, who was one of the heads of Mizrachi in Eretz Yisrael. He obtained certificates. Everybody had an allocation of certificates for people that they could bring from war-torn Europe to Palestine. It was very limited. The immigration into Palestine of Jews during the Second World War was very, very limited. It was extremely difficult to get into Palestine. And the Zionists, every certificate was worth an absolute fortune and was valuable to them, not just in terms of the money, but in human resources. Who are they bringing? What are those people going to do when they arrive in Palestine? Who are they and why should they come? Because everybody wanted to get out of Europe, and for them to get to Palestine was extremely difficult. He writes here that the Belzer Rebbe arrived in Eretz Yisrael as a result of the visa that was issued in his name, the certificate was issued in his name, that should have been issued for Moshe Nachum Sternberg's father's name. Here's a picture of Moshe Nachum Sternberg's father. His name was Zvulun Yonason Sternberg. And this takes us back to the Castner Train. Zvulun Yonason Sternberg was one of the Vatikim of the Zionist movement in Hungary. He was head of Mizrachi, a very frum man, very devoutly religious, But he was completely committed to Zionism for whatever reason, and he worked very hard for the Zionist cause, the Frum Zionist cause in Hungary during the 1930s. And he was one of those that was chosen by Moshe Shapira to obtain a certificate to get into Eretz Yisrael during this critical period, in this 1943-44 period, just before the Nazis overran Hungary. And Moshe Nochem Sternberg, his son, actually visited Moshe Shapira during the Second World War. He was 15 years old at that stage. And he went to visit Moshe Shapira together with his uncle and tried to understand why it was that his father wasn't coming. Moshe Shapira was very vague. Wouldn't give him an answer. He wouldn't. That's what this testimony says. I haven't scanned it. Perhaps I should scan it. If somebody wants to scan, if you just let me know, and perhaps I'll scan it and we can send out a PDF. Fascinating information in there. He says that as it turned out, his father knew that the Belzer Rebbe wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael. He was in Budapest. Belzer Rebbe was not one of the Vosikim of the Zionist movement. On the contrary, he'd been an anti-Zionist. And his son, Moshe Nochem, was very angry when the Belzer Rebbe arrived, as soon as he realized, excuse me, the Belzer Rebbe stole my father's certificate. Thankfully, his father, Zvulun Yonason, managed to obtain a place on the train that Castner put together. And he became extremely close to a person who should have been his nemesis, the Satmar Rebbe. In fact, they were in the same barracks and they did everything together. You know that Zvulun Yonason knew all the tefillos, all the davening, Baal Peh by heart, and he wrote them out before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, so that people could daven. They were written onto big cards, and they were held up, the cards, in the barracks in Bergen-Belsen, and he was able that way to enable people to daven on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And he did everything together with the Satmar Rebbe, even though they didn't see eye to eye in terms of hashkafa, because Yonason Zvulun was a Zionist, and of course the Satmar Rebbe was a very strong anti-Zionist. Nevertheless, they were very close in Bergen-Belsen. Eventually, those people who were in Bergen-Belsen were taken by train to Switzerland. But by that time, Yonason Zvulun was very sick. He'd become sick in Bergen-Belsen during their time there. They were there for months. And when he arrived in Switzerland, within a matter of weeks, he died. So he never made it out. In his place, the Belzer Rebbe and the Belzer Rebbe's brother, the Bilgerai Rov, did make it out. And the son writes here, it's fascinating how he puts it together. He did all the research, and some of it is very uncomfortable and upsetting to read. But eventually he reconciles himself to the fact that his father made the ultimate sacrifice, knowing that he could die, to enable the Belzer Rebbe to come to Eretz Yisrael and to be there as an inspiration for the Jewish people. With that, we'll leave it, and I thank you so much for listening to Treasures from the Rabbi's Library and for being part of the group that is so devoted to Jewish history. Thank you.